Good evening. My name is Michael Schreiber. I am the president of the Chelsea Reform Democratic Club, CRDC. We are pleased to have everybody here tonight. Just as an initial announcement, we are being filmed tonight, and so if anybody has any concerns about being filmed, you can sit in the back row, and we have assurances that you'll not appear on camera. Thank you. For those of you who are not aware, Chelsea Reform Democratic Club is our local democratic organization here in Chelsea. We are a progressive club. We have monthly speakers. We have always been at the forefront of LGBT rights in New York and in the country, and our elected officials have also been at the forefront of LGBT rights. The program was essentially conceived because last year there seemed to be an enormous amount of coverage in the Olympics with regard to the Russian LGBT situation, and since that time there's been a significant decrease in coverage, and yet the problem remains, and it remains quite serious. We have a number of organizations in our community that are helping Russians who are now here, and we also have the benefit of local leaders who are from Russia to help us all understand where we stand currently.
Thank you for that introduction. I wouldn't actually say that I'm on the front lines of this issue because I'm in New York, and happily so, for over a year, and that's we'll be getting to why that's so important for so many people. So, as Michael said, basically about a year ago, there was a lot of talk about what was going on in Russia, or actually a little more than a year ago, with the anti-gay campaign that had been unleashed by the Kremlin. And now, reading the papers in this country, or in any other country, you might get the impression that that was all over, or it had dissipated. And it hasn't. What has actually happened is that both the legislation and sort of the public campaign of hate and violence has just been developing at its own speed, very much in the way that was designed when it was first put into place, and that was set in motion about 3 years ago. So what happened about 3 years ago was that suddenly the Kremlin started talking about homosexuality as sort of menace number one, as homosexuals as enemy of the state number one. The thing that got the most publicity in this country was the so-called homosexual propaganda law, which is more than it sounds, right? The ban on homosexual propaganda, which was approved by the Russian Duma in June of 2013. The Russian Duma is the Russian Parliament. Bans the propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations, which the Constitutional Court has defined to mean the distribution of information that can cause harm to the physical or spiritual development of children, including forming in them the erroneous impression of social equality of traditional and non-traditional marital relations. So basically it's a law that creates second-class citizenship, and that makes it a crime to talk about social equality. And just from listening to what I just said, you can tell that it's a law that can be applied to absolutely anybody, any sort of cultural product, any speech, under almost any circumstances, except maybe one adult talking to himself or herself. And that's a distinguishing characteristic of laws that totalitarian regimes pass. They have to be designed for selective enforcement. They're designed not so much to punish people who are guilty of a particular infraction or whatever is considered an infraction, as to instill fear in as many people as possible. But in this particular case, it was also part of a larger campaign to not only instill fear, but to provoke violence. And so the passage of the law, which was passed first in some towns, then in some larger cities, and then finally on the federal level, the passage of the law was accompanied by well-orchestrated violence. For example, on the day that the Duma finally voted to pass the law in final reading, on June 11, 2013, there was a small LGBT protest outside the parliament, and there were maybe a couple of dozen people who were protesting, and there were about 300 people who had come to basically beat up the protesters, to throw feces at us, to throw urine-filled baggies at us, and all of this was happening in plain view of the cameras, in plain view of the police, until they had worked up enough of a rage and enough of violence for the police to round up the protesters, not the vandals, not the thugs who were beating us up, the protesters, and take the protesters on buses to a police station. Now, when we were being put onto buses, I asked a policeman, why are you arresting us rather than them? And he said, we're doing it for your own protection. He also said, because look at how many of them there are. Now, by that point, we'd actually been able to document that some of the people who were on the thugs' side were paid to be there. Right? So, I thought, what a horrible thing to say, that they're taking us to the police for our own protection. Well, it was a horrible thing to say, and it was a humiliating thing to experience, but there were a couple of people who were left behind who weren't rounded up onto buses, and they were chased down the street in Moscow in broad daylight and beaten within an inch of their lives. So, in a sense, the police were telling the truth. It was, at that point, better for us to be rounded up and put onto buses and taken to a police station. But that kind of violence was broadcast for the entire country to see. And the message was very clear. These are people on whom it's open season. You will be praised, you will be televised, you will become a celebrity for beating up these people. And you will certainly not be punished. Now, since then, as many of you have heard, that kind of open season has expanded to include many other people, including people very prominent in the political opposition. And that's as it always happens, right? A scapegoated minority never stays alone. The campaign of hate always expands. The violence always expands. That's exactly what's happening in Russia. But that doesn't mean that LGBT people have been left alone. It just means that violence is proceeding sort of apace, just as it was happening a couple of years ago. Gathering spaces are under attack. Most LGBT gathering spaces in most Russian cities have been forced to close because of the ongoing attacks on them. Others have gone deep underground, simply to maintain physical security. There's a lot of random, in addition to the sort of organized violence and for the cameras violence, there's random violence. A very well-known Russian actor, Alexei Devotchenko, who was found dead in his own apartment a couple of months ago, as just one example of a kind of targeted violence. But there's also random violence on the streets against people, and not just in the streets, in cafes and clubs, against people who are perceived as being non-traditional sexual orientation, whatever that might mean at that particular moment. Now, what has also happened is that legislation, which is designed for selective enforcement, has gradually started to get enforced. Initially, the primary purpose of it was just to be part of this campaign. It wasn't to create a particular legal climate, but ultimately this is what started happening. So, probably the most tragic case that has occurred is the case of Children 404, which is an online community for LGBT teenagers that was founded 2 years ago. It has been fighting off charges of homosexual propaganda. A couple of times it was successful in fighting off these charges, but at this point it looks like it's going to be forced to close. They've had to close some of their pages on Russian social networks, and they may be forced to close others, or the Russian Consumer Authority, which can block access to any resource, is likely to place them on the list of banned resources. in addition to obviously just incredible stress for the founder, the very brave and wonderful founder of this online community, and huge legal expenses for her, this is a lifeline, literally, for tens of thousands of teenagers who've been writing letters to each other through this online community, who've been making connections. There's nothing else I can say except it is a lifeline, and that lifeline is about to be cut off. It's been cut off for some of them. It will be cut off for for all of them, it looks like, in the very near future. And another target of sort of legislative and quasi-legislative measures have been LGBT families. So at the same time that the parliament passed the ban on homosexual propaganda, it passed another law. It passed an amendment to the law on adoptions that banned adoptions by same-sex couples or single people from countries where same-sex marriage is legal. The way that Russian adoption law is enforced, effectively that becomes retroactive. So it can be used against any family that has an adopted child. That was one of the reasons that my family had to leave the country, because we had been threatened with enforcement of that law against us. And my oldest son is adopted, and our lawyer had advised us to. He said basically the answer to your question is at the airport when I asked him what we should do. Informally, social services have gotten the message that even though there hasn't been a law that the parliament threatened to pass that would take children, even biological children, out of same-sex families, effectively the social services have gotten the message that that's what they should be doing. So we've been hearing reports of social services going after children of same-sex couples, male couples, female couples, couples who are perceived as being same-sex. And those are the people who are most vulnerable, and this is where I get to the conclusion of my talk and pass the baton to somebody who can talk about people coming here. The people who are most vulnerable in Russia are obviously people who are clearly LGBT, but especially LGBT families with children. And one of the things that makes them especially vulnerable is not just that the authorities can go after them, and not just that it's particularly difficult to avoid any contact with the state if you have children, but also that it's really difficult to emigrate if you have children. Because at this point, the way that people are coming here, and people are coming here in droves, Immigration Equality, which is a wonderful organization that represents LGBT asylum seekers, hired a full-time Russian-speaking staff person a year ago, and I think they're still having trouble keeping up with the caseload. They still have long lines of people waiting for representation, and the Russian caseload is slowly, or actually not so slowly, overwhelming people coming in from other countries. But the way people come here is they come here on tourist visas, then they ask for asylum, and that means for about a year you're in limbo. You have no right to virtually any public assistance. You do not have the right to work, and you don't know where your livelihood is going to be coming from. If you're a single young person or maybe a young couple, then you can see yourself sleeping on people's couches for a year. If you're a family with kids, that is just too frightening to contemplate. And those are the people who wait the longest to leave the country until the danger is really palpable. And I don't know that all of them are getting out in time. Which is not to say that other people who don't have children don't need help. Everybody needs help. I think at this point the only solution to Russia's anti-gay problem is to help people leave the country. That's the only way that LGBT people in Russia are going to be safe until there is regime change. Thank you.